right. Chris, are we all set? Cool. All right, testing, testing. Hey, everybody. So glad to hear all the conversations, all the life, all the connections, all the relationships being invested in right now. But let's please turn our attention for just a moment. For this next hour, we're going to keep it to a sharp hour. We want to respect Dr. James's time. But I just want to introduce her really briefly first. Last year we had a lecture during Black History Month. We had Rebecca Wilcox come and speak. And I saw from across the room as we were getting set up, I saw someone with like a gray cap and gray mask. And I was like, is that Dr. Joy James? And I went over and said hi, and I was like, are you Dr. Joy James? She's like, I'm Joy. I couldn't believe that I got to meet her. Dr. James, as I've mentioned before, is my favorite working intellectual, someone whose work I respect so deeply. I couldn't believe I got to meet her last week, and I can't believe she's actually here to speak with us this morning. And I just want to say a couple of things to contextualize her for you. Joy James is the Ebenezer Fitch Professor of Humanities at Williams College. Her areas of expertise are political theory, human rights, anti-blackness and genocide, feminisms, abolitionisms. And then you can see all the courses that she teaches. And I feel like I want to quit and just go and take all these classes with her. Things like Cold War intellectual, civil rights, writers in the CIA, the impact of Black Panther Party intellectuals on political theory, Black Marxism, political theory and anti-colonialism, representations of racial, sexual violence from enslavement to emancipation, Cuba, US, Africa, and resistance to Black enslavement. There's so much. There's so many books. I could list you all the titles that she's written. And so I know not all of us are people within the space of the academy or are familiar with her work, but just take it from me, if my word means everything. She's the real deal, and we are extremely honored and privileged to have her here today. So can we welcome Dr. Joy James?
Thank you so much. So good afternoon. And I want to start by saying thank you so much for this beautiful sanctuary that you've created or maintained or inherited. I know that we're all doing as much as we can or as much as we think about doing in terms of addressing the precarity that not only we face in this country, but the violence that has gone around the globe. People mentioned the wars that we need to oppose. People talked about the poverty, the dispossession, people who feel that they no longer can stay on this planet, so they exit prematurely. And I just, even though I try to go to church on a regular basis, and, maybe emphasize try more and make it all caps, start doing it more, but really just the music, the care, the language that you've offered is very healing. So I'm just giving you my appreciation before we start a conversation. So I am an academic do you go by Reverend Connor, or what do you, just Connor, okay. And I go by Joy. And I know often in organizing, there's a sense, and I've been one of the people writing and talking about this sense that academia can provide a wonderful platform, but it also can become a bit of a trampoline where you're jumping high to be seen and to articulate what you consider to be ethical, but then you land back down in the same spot. And so really the change that I see that allows us to think about sanctuaries, and I'm old enough to remember the sanctuary movement under the Reagan administration, where people took in folks from El Salvador when the US was funding Contras, which are essentially death squads. I grew up in a military family, so part of where I was living and having a good life as a child was at Fort Benning, Georgia. It was also known as the School of the Americas, and that pacifists and people of the faith also called it the School of the Assassins. So there's a way in which our history tracks us to this moment, and the younger generations would have to study that history, but some of us have lived through it. And so again, I believe that the academy is not really the appropriate place to express the commitments that Connor was talking about. You can do it, but I don't find, having been there for decades, I don't find it to be a sanctuary that would allow you to hold on to those commitments and be faithful. And so when I go to other places beyond the academy, that's when I start to recall how much we have, even though there's been so much that we have lost. So I want to read a bit from New Bones Abolition. This was a book I wasn't planning to do, but I had been living in Harlem when Erica Garner was alive. And I had, gone a couple of times to Staten Island for conferences, but I did not go to the protest after her father, Eric Garner, was killed by chest compression and chokehold in 2014. And I wasn't aware when she transitioned in December 2017 that she had so many vulnerabilities in terms of health issues, but also that the New York City government, NYPD, had never allowed the monetary settlement around her father's death. And this is what I called, when I was watching Black Lives Matter, the monetization of Black death. And it's not just Black people dying at the hands of, police forces that are way too aggressive, right? And everybody who's killing civilians is not white, right? When you think of Tyree Nichols in Memphis. But what I remember from 2014 is the organizing, going out to some of the protests, and in 2017, when she transitioned after giving birth to her son that she named after her father, Eric Garner. So that second child was 4 months old when his mother transitioned. That the medical care wasn't there, the emotional, mental health support wasn't there sufficiently. And then the way, I'm just going to keep coming back to sanctuary, the sanctuary wasn't stable. So I decided that for the year of 2018, if ever I was asked to speak anywhere, so I was on campus at Williams for Black History Month. We have some books. I don't know if you pass them around, if anybody's interested and wants to take a look at them. There are photos inside that show some of the images that I'm talking about. Or invited to go to a Juris International Conference in Sao Paulo, or to speak at wherever. What I wanted to do was to remember what she gave as a 27-year-old mother and what she gave as a daughter. But I also want to address, how is it that she did not become one of the prominent people that we would remember? And so again, I didn't do a biography on her. It was more of a meditation, and it was also that I was mortified. Because, as a middle-class academic, I do have leisure time. But when it's not helping family or being supportive of family, then it's being inside of books. And what I regret, no shame, but a regret, is that I, in my mind, was not sufficiently involved in community to be aware of lack of resources here, lack of acknowledgement there. So after her transition, this is the book, New Bones Abolition, Captive Maternal Agency, and the Afterlife of Erica Garner. The revenues from the book go to Prison Radio, which was started on the West Coast in California. One of the co-founders is Noel Hannaran, who is actually one of the attorneys for Mumia Abu-Jamal, who's been incarcerated for over 44 years, right? And in this book, I want to read briefly from it. I know Connor sent me this list, like he's the teacher, these questions, okay, number one, what's the definition of agape? Which I have no real idea. But the start of this book actually came from this beautiful poet. Do you know who Lucille Clifton is? Yeah. So happy Black History Month. And I'm not great at reading poetry, but I do want to share this with you. The title of her poem is New Bones. And so that became the title of the book because I was at a conference, I was Zoom with people in California, and a friend of mine, Sally, we had gone to Union Seminary together, and she's always sending me these wonderful things to meditate about. Poetry, music, Leonard Cohen saying, that's when you allow the cracks, that's when the light comes in, which is, you know, one of the lyrics in one of his songs. And so when I was getting stressed out about prepping for a conference, Sally sent me this poem, New Bones, by Lucille Clifton. We will wear new bones again. We will leave these rainy days, break out through another mouth, into sun and honey time. Worlds buzz over us like bees. We be splendid in new bones. Other people think they know how long life is, how strong life is. We know. And so my interpretation of the poem was even in our losses, even in the ways that we forget, I'm referring to the middle class, about how people who don't have homes, who don't have sufficient or adequate medical care or insurance, how much precarity and vulnerability that they face on a regular basis. Even though we see a lot of brutality, a lot of death, and a lot of war, and Connor was talking a lot about war resistance, right? Despite of that, we have knowledge. And what we know is that even when we're broken, we can mend. But for me, what I'm very interested in is what kind of environments could we create to facilitate that kind of healing, and also that kind of resistance. So I want to read a couple of chapters, and then I just want to end by saying a little bit about the captive maternal, which is a concept that I've been talking about for about the last 8 years. So the last 2 pages of New Bones Abolition. I'm going to mop up your floor in a minute. All right. We lose family and community members, clean water and air, fecund soil and kin species. Peaceful protesters and political prisoners are killed by police and troopers or disappeared into jails and prisons by bureaucracies and bureaus. As noted earlier in the book, in Atlanta, the FBI incarcerated activists and environmentalists on terrorist charges after Georgia State Patrol shot a meditating environmental and community protector, also known as Tortuguita, 57 times. Current and future generations of political prisoners are to be captured and broken, yet we mend. From the state's aggressions against us and the conflicts and attacks by hustlers and compradors. New Bones growth is uncomfortable when not painful, yet it is shared through connectors between individuals, communities, and ethics that transfer bones into branches of agape-enriched aspen. Our underground, and Connor was talking about the hypocenter, so I make a differentiation between the epicenter, which is on the surface of politics, and the hypocenter. And again, I grew up in the military, so you would call it ground zero. That's where they tested, atomic bombs and explosion. But that's also where the rebels went when they were being hunted by the FBI. New Bones growth is uncomfortable when not painful, yet it is shared through connectors between individuals, communities, and ethics that transfer bones into branches of agape-enriched aspen. Our underground will burrow toward the hypocenter. Conduits of shared root systems will distinguish performers and attention seekers from workers and the warriors. Some will be distracted by spectacle and/or X, which, it's Twitter. Others mutate and clone into terrain that cradles marronage and maps out strategies of war resistance against predatory policing. Marrow mutates abolitionist borough. Living cultures digging deeper can decipher performance capture from risk-taking disciplined communities and commitments. New Bones Abolition will stabilize communities, forests, food, flowers, and gardens. The mandate exists within our cultures. Ordinary people within a rapacious democracy resist self-objectification and capitalist consumption. In Mind of My Mind, science fiction author Octavia Butler asks, quote, "Could a creature who had to look upon ordinary people literally as food and shelter ever understand how strongly those people value life?" End quote. Honor ancestors and avoid hungry ghosts. Return to the sources of spiritual, emotional, and maternal and material sustenance that connect and discipline us. Providing self-protections and security, we resist to pour a foundation solidified into political will love. This reflection on abolition and captive maternal agency, with a note and a nod to Erica Garner, began with Lucille Clifton's poem, New Bones. It ends with an excerpt from the poem titled My Mama's Love and Her Mama's Hold, Lie Mama Lie, by then 19-year-old Isaiah Blake, whose gift to me on Mother's Day, May 12, 2019, unveiled a Yoruba's captive maternal. And this is a quote from the excerpt of Isaiah's poem. Mama, you threw me deep into the ground, sent me backwards spinning 3,000 years into the roots of old okra, old yam, old watermelon, and bloody red beets. I got love for the captive maternal. So in this tribute, I'm dropping things today. In this tribute, I kind of wanted to step out of the convention of being an academic and just have feelings. Because part of the way in which we're trained is that our rigor is embedded in abstraction and distance from people's feelings and people's needs. And even though my dissertation was on Hannah Arendt, who studied fascism, right? Who escaped Nazi Germany, worked briefly in the resistance, was able to come to the United States at a time when the United States was also barring ships that were bringing refugees from Europe from docking in the United States and returning them, of course, back to Europe and to Germany. So what I wanted to do, or what I wanted to become, was an academic who understood, yeah, why not? Who understands the value of sanctuary, but that it's not, you know, a 5-star hotel, and you can't just check in. You have to build it. And so in this text and other texts, there's also some brochures over there about Cop City. I was grad students in Michigan who talked to me about Cop City in Atlanta, and so I went down and I met with some of the protesters had been in the forest and were trying to stop the demolition to create a police training camp that would be militarized. And I saw their fear, and I saw their passion, and I saw their commitment, and how even though they couldn't go back into the forest because the helicopters were buzzing around, and because someone they loved had been shot 57 times when they were sitting cross-legged with their hands in the air, they still had that love and courage. And so for me, maybe my job is just to figure out with text, with quoting poetry, with showing up, how I could also contribute to war resistance. Because I see, as a political scientist, based on my training, but also based on my love for community, that this is going to be a 360 rap war. And the privileged will probably be able to avoid most of the carnage and the loss. But the people who are most vulnerable, whether they're in the Congo, or whether they're in Gaza, or whether they're in Ukraine, those people are part of us as well. So when I was listening to Connor, these are the notes that I took down, and then I'll just stop. One of them was, how is it that we could think about war resistance and deal with our fear? And I remember, I think I've said before in other places, whatever, Mumia's concept of love, not fear, when I first heard it 2 years ago, I completely rejected it. I was a bit of a jerk, what I said. So he didn't hear it, but his committee did. So they still talk to me, but it was only after listening to Mumia say it over and over again and knowing that he's had open heart surgery, he's been denied medicine. There's different ways to kill people in prison other than with nitrogen, right? And an execution. There's different ways to disappear rebels. But he insists that we love each other and that we build sanctuaries, right? So that was one of the things that I was thinking about when I was listening to Connor. The other thing I was thinking about is, what is the role of spirituality in what we do? And is spirit enough to quell the fear, or do we just do what we're supposed to do as ethical people despite the fear? And I guess the last thing, and I'll stop there, would be, maybe this is my question for y'all. How do you continue to love yourself when the victories don't roll out the way they should be? Like, however you tithe, however you march, however you protest, how much you donate, we can't stop these wars. And if we can't, then I'm wondering what our function is. That's not to say that we have no function in family or with children or with elders or with, people needing care or protecting LGBTQ, trans people from being hunted and mocked. But in a democracy where you cannot control the government's bloodlust, that seems to me to be like a Minotaur's maze. And I would love to exit, and I obviously can't do it as an individual, but maybe this comes full circle about the new bones. Maybe the breakage becomes a gift. Because we're broken, we have to mend, and because we have to mend, we have to create something outside the box. And so our ability to have spirit, despite the material conditions of struggle, may in fact be an inheritance that has lasted from the first Maroon ran to flee from captivity, but always returns as an ancestor. So thank you.
So now we're just open discussion, just questions for Dr. James. If anyone has one, raise your hand and enunciate. And I don't know if you end up feeling comfortable enough to restate it for the microphone, so live stream folks
Sure.
can hear it, but yeah, anybody with a question, just raise your hand.
Aside from at Williams, who I assume come to your class because they're interested in this subject, how do you think other students in a pretty remote college, who are pretty white primarily, how do you think that they're, from your impressions, are sort of perceiving these issues that are so critical?
Right, so we have winter study, and so because it's a very affluent school, right? Some kids went to China, some went to Italy to study opera, and I had 14 come to Manhattan to stay in the International Hostel on West 103rd in Amsterdam. And so they met with We Act, which is an environmental organization talking about the need to have the rats are like out of control, obviously in New York City, but the need to have sanitation, the need to have green spaces. We went to the United Nations, which, I'm conflicted, but people need to see everything, right? Or we went on tour, and the guide was talking a lot about peacekeepers. And I remember because years ago when I was in seminary, I worked at the Methodist United Nations, an NGO that was across the street from UN, and we did seminars. And so that's decades ago. I asked the same question we asked decades ago. What happens when peacekeepers go to Haiti or other countries and girls and women are assaulted? Do they have any protection, or the babies that are left behind? Is anybody compensating for that? And the answer was, we're working on it. And the same thing we asked about white phosphorus, used in the Middle East in the war. We're working on it. And so part of the students' frustration I shared with them is that what we were told would be functional and the protection of human rights, what we told would be care, is not functional. Now, how a 19-year-old processes that, I don't know. But I know, I'm much older and I'm still trying to process it. They also did volunteer work around, food safety or security, organizing clothing. They met with people who had protested in 2020 around George Floyd, and also who experienced the violence. One woman has had 2 to 3 surgeries on her neck because the NYPD put her in a particular chokehold, even though that's how Eric Garner died, right? And I believe if we follow the paper, there's going to be a $2 to $3 million settlement for the activists who were kettled in the Bronx. So I don't know how teenagers deal with their frustration. I think some of them just emotionally checked out. I'd rather go in the village and party as soon as she stops talking about human rights and all this stuff, right? But there was a small core of them that were very dedicated. And so my experience from having taught at Bramley, different schools, there's going to be a fraction of them who will take a risk in order to do what they think is ethical. And that's actually going around the country right now with students. I know there's a fixation or focus on faculty or presidents, the 4 presidents, UPenn, Harvard, et cetera, but the students are stressed out as well. And I think for them it becomes, where do you go for role models? And so sometimes there's a romanticism about the past, this is what the Panthers did. It's yeah, even if you were living back then or you were that age, the majority of people would not have joined the party because of the risk. And there were contradictions inside the party. But come '69, when the FBI and the Chicago Police Department assassinate Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, then you understand what I call, you don't have to use my language, but sort of the bloodlust. There's different ways to resolve your disdain for a particular race of people and your fear of their demanding their rights. It does not always have to be a lethal outcome. My understanding of this democracy, having grown up where I did, having served in ROTC for years, having lived with a military officer who is in Vietnam, Korea, around the globe, following an agenda which was not about liberation, my assessment is this is a very dangerous empire. And I think the students would rather do well on Wall Street than have a confrontation. That's not true of all the students, but I would say about 2/3 by the second week, they pretty much had reached their limit about understanding the material conditions of struggle. So thanks for your question.
I wonder what you think about the electoral arena, whether that's something that is worth pursuing.
Yeah, to repeat the question, what do you think about the electoral arena, and is it a valid way to pursue, our ethics? I paraphrased you, if that's okay. I was a visiting prophet at UT when Obama was elected, and I stood in long lines because it was like a thrill thing. But it was also McCain and probably more than McCain, because I'm used to military people, it would have been Sarah Palin. Was for me like kind of scary. And now, I mean, the fear level is just like shot through the roof. I voted then, and I voted pretty much through all the other elections, but I was becoming exhausted. Like the thrill is gone. I think that's a B.B. King song or something, right? When you do my writing, it's not always popular what I write, but I ended up writing that Obama was your first, not just your first black president, he was your first black imperial president. So you were going to get the same kind of violence, huge amounts of our tax dollars, billions of dollars going out to buy military hardware, and pretty much listening to Wall Street billionaires about what they wanted, and corporations like Raytheon. So I was on a podcast yesterday, and we were talking about the same question you brought up. My position is you should vote, just as was stated by one of your parishioners. But I can't tell the kids, I'm sorry if I'm condescending by calling them kids, the young adults who are so angry right now, I can't tell them who to vote for president, right? And I understand that if they do what they say they're going to do, then you're probably going to have a second administration of somebody you may not want. But I talked about down ballot. Like maybe there's a way to, you know, having lived, my father was at Fort Sam, Houston. That was his last deployment. So I grew up in Texas, which is just like a hellhole state. So there's a way, if you can control local politics and state politics, you won't have these kind of bans where it's okay for a potential mother to die in childbirth because somebody needs to make a political message, right? However you feel about reproductive rights and abortion, the way it's unfolding is so incredibly punitive, it's just gonna expand the carceral arena. And the majority of women who will be charged with homicides will probably be low-income women and black women. So you're just gonna expand the prison industrial complex, right? That's a phrase I don't always use, but I use it now. The same about the death penalty expanding. And I had worked on a case with a colleague of mine around Kevin Johnson. And this is a case I had also brought to my students. And up to the day of his execution in Missouri, I actually thought that these petitions and these hearings and that what he did as a teenager after he believed the police had killed his 12-year-old brother, in I would call it a nervous breakdown, just walk out yelling, "You killed my brother," and just start shooting, that there would be, if not space for forgiveness, then a space for a certain kind of sanity, that if you kill to stop killing, that's really not how things work. So it's important, if people are saying, we're signing these petitions to stop the 13th Amendment, I know organizers who are doing that, and that's a state-by-state referendum. So we know that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, right? It also legalized it if you've been duly convicted of a crime. That was a Trojan horse after the Civil War, which Du Bois, writes in Black Reconstruction. Some 200,000 black people fought in the Civil War, which is probably why the North won. And so the way you think the state, when it gives you law and order, is promising you safety, my assessment, that's really a Trojan horse. So if you cannot control the presidential election, because remember, this is not a direct democracy, it's representative. That's why the Electoral College chooses the president. Hillary Clinton had 1 to 2 million more votes than Donald Trump in 2016. He was just smart about the map, right? And Al Gore had more votes than George Bush. It wasn't just that the Supreme Court got involved in it, but it's also, we don't have a direct democracy. I think the majority of Americans are decent, even if we're, you know, heavily invested in consumerism and on our digitals. But a growing percentage of Americans are white nationalists with a serious grievance against any form of integration and any form of diversity. And so, having lived in Texas in my high school years, and also having been introduced to Christianity by chaplains who also bless war weaponry, right? I was always curious about what people thought about the rapture when I was a teen. And when I was a teen in Texas, it was pretty clear. You know, we'd be in the park with the guitars and we were singing all the songs, which I don't remember, so that might be, you know, suppression and trauma. So Jesus was going to return and take the good people back with them. The 21st century version, based on the scholarship I've looked at, is that Jesus wants a genocide. You have to eliminate all the Muslims, all the Jews, all the people of color, and that's when Jesus will return. So people are forming armies to bring the rapture in real time, but through genocidal violence. Palestine is not the only genocide going down right now. And it's not the only planned one that we're funding. So, I mean, this is the thing about reality. We will vote, we will be kind, we will be good to our neighbors, and somewhere on that list, there has to be, and we will confront an empire. And the absence of that being on the list on the fridge, we're not in play. And if we're not in play, then we're just like, you know, blow a kiss to the kids and say good luck. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to quote one of my favorite authors, Studs Terkel.
Yeah.
Hope dies last. I was going to ask you, in the context of the earlier comments that you made, what do you view as the utility of hope? You think it's still something that is, that we can wrap our arms around?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, it's complicated, multi-part. So what do we think of hope, and how do we address hope? And Studs Terkel, who was a union organizer in Chicago, I think, and he's transitioned a number of years ago, but his writings are out there. A white labor organizer, very militant, very clear, right? Hope dies last would be the quote from Studs Terkel. So I think hope is imperative, but I also think it's tricky because people perform it. And then it becomes like a commodity item. I mean, you think of it like the Rainbow Coalition. I'll use that because that's a hopeful thing. That, you know, despite our ethnicities, despite or because of our different presentations of, you know, origins, Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, indigenous, we can all work together. So what Fred Hampton was known for was the Rainbow Coalition. So working with white Appalachian, poor people who had come to Chicago and being harassed by the police, working with Puerto Rican, Chicano, who came to Chicago for a better living. You know, people were coming to these cities in the 1960s and before to get out of the fields. So it's not just Cesar Chavez, you know, people in California picking, you know, pesticide-laden fruit, right? Or black people, like my mother and her twin sister were sent to the fields when they were 5 years old in Mississippi to pick cotton, right? So people have hope because then they transition to climb the ring to be middle class different ways. But the political hope, I guess that's what I'm trying to get to when I talk about Fred Hampton, is that we could align ourselves together, not just like how do we benefit from being in the U.S., right? This large consumer society, getting our degrees, you know, being able to stabilize, buy our apartment or our brownstone, send our kids to college, et cetera, et cetera. But how could we have hope that we could actually change this political environment, not just in a performative way? So what happens after Fred Hampton is killed in Chicago, another Chicago leader picks up the rainbow image and visual, right, and language. And that's going to be Jesse Jackson. But Jesse Jackson has his pluses and he has his minuses. The plus would be that he had worked with Martin Luther King. The minus would be that often our movements are turned into hustles. So I talk in New Bones about high status hustle and low status hustle. The third co-optation of the Rainbow Coalition would be who? It's another Chicago, yeah. There's something about the water in Chicago. So it's going to be Barack Obama, but now it's just like this rainbow hope, and hope is part of his, you know, campaign tag, right? But it's not grounded, what are the needs of poor people, because the position is poor people don't vote, so why should we listen to them, right? And what happened with the poison water in Flint, when he goes down and the people think, you know, he has a, like I have here, I know your water's not poison, but he's holding a cup of water and he starts to sip. And working class poor people, mostly black in the audience, so love this president. They're like, no, 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 don't drink the water, get bottled water. But they didn't understand it was a performance piece. He was sipping it to say the water's fine. The water is not fine. And they never got compensation. When they realized the water was so bad that it was eroding the paint on new cars, they got clean water for those cars. But they didn't get the clean water for the people. And I went there one, I can't remember the year, and I was just starting to reference it. I don't live there, I'm gonna fly back to some bougie place. Like, but a black mother in the back just started sobbing and just walked out. It's like, I can't, maybe we didn't talk. But I was just going through the list with you. But then there's these moments when you remember people live these conditions. This is not my personal grievance list. People watch their children get poisoned by lead, and then they can't get special ed support for them. And since they can't, the kids are going to dysregulate, which means they're more likely to go to juvie, which is going to be more likely to go to prison. There's all these ways that hope still exists, but we would have to fight for the material conditions to make it look hopeful. And I'm not sure that the middle class has signed on for that. And I would say, this is the thing I mean about the captive maternal 5 stages. On the level of care, we all hustle. Even if you are affluent and you're black and your kid's gonna go to that private elite school, there's gonna be some denigration and some stuff going on, and that's gonna have an impact on their mental health. But it's gonna be preferable, that's what we tell ourselves, than if they go to a local school in Harlem, right? Where there's going to be metal detectors and NYPD walking up and down the hall, right? We're still hopeful because we care. We still function because we care. But the first stage of the captive maternal is care and caretaking. The second stage is protesting, and we often do it individually. Like, I'm going to talk to the president the way you're treating my kid, because they're trans, you're letting them be mocked in school or whatever, they're, you know. Or you find out that as individuals, it's not sufficient, and you become exhausted or you become bitter, or both. You can be both. The third would be you go from protest to a movement, and that's what happened in 2020 and before 2020. So from 2014 on, I mean, there have always been movements, right? Civil rights movement, Black liberation movement, American Indian movement. Leonard Peltier is still in prison, right? Is a member of American Indian movement. When you go to the movement, when it hits a wall or maybe $1 billion plus dollars got flooded in and you get these nonprofits, people scale back and they go back down. the people who were going to the hypo center, they pushed back into Maranaj, as Connor was talking about before. How can you have autonomy, dignity, and deliver clean water, decent schools, healthy people, safe streets? But my estimation, the way I see it, because I also write about Attica, when you think of it, Attica people all the incarcerated go through the same thing. They care for each other, they sing songs for each other. It's the trustees who clean the prisons, who cook the food, who deliver it. It was a trustee that kept Mumia alive in the hospital infirmary, right? So what happens in Maranaj when we try for autonomy, it is prohibited by the state. And that's where war comes in. So what happened at Attica, which Connor was referring to, weeks after George Jackson was killed by prison guards, and Foucault, it's not because Foucault says it, but I'm an academic wonk, so I say it. Michel Foucault wrote that that was an assassination. He was running for a brick wall he couldn't scale, and the guard shot him in the back. So 3 weeks later, or 4 weeks later in September, on the other side of a continent, the people in Attica who never met George, because he went in when he was 18 and he was killed when he was 30, they read him, and in his work, they saw his love for them and the recognition of their dignity. So they start to protest. They won't eat their food, they won't pick up the utensils, and at some point they take over the prison. What happens after that? That's the autonomy, right? That's the Maranaj. You create a maroon camp inside prison walls, and it's starting to freeze in upstate New York. But you still do it because you say, don't call me the N-word anymore, don't beat me, don't put me in solitary confinement, don't make me work 8 hours for 27 cents an hour. And the whole thing is like, I'm human, I'm a man. They weren't trying to leave prison. They were like, no, we'll stay, but you can't be brutal. And you can't dishonor us, and you can't break us. Broken bones, right? So the Governor Nelson Rockefeller calls, I believe, President Nixon. After the call, there's a call into the National Guard. And the National Guard come in with weapons from the Vietnam War. And not to say that I saw them around the house, but that's what my father was doing, right? So they treated it as war. This is why I keep going to war resistance. And I don't know, I think people think I'm hyperbolic when I say war. Like, no, I'm not, because I've seen like both sides of it, right? So what do the National Guard do? They shoot through the prison guards who are hostages in order to kill the rebels. And most of the rebels are black. In Orisami's Burton book that you mentioned, which is a wonderful book, the National Guard retreats and they give the prison back to the prison guards, and then they kill additional people who are already stripped naked, who are already shackled. And so this is the bloodlust. If you can't control the bloodlust of the state, then what is our function? And that's a question like I posed to myself. I mean, at some point, I'll be glad to retire, because as long as I'm teaching, I feel like I'm obligated. What I say to you is what I say to 19-year-olds. I don't know if they can handle it, but I'm like you probably, somebody should tell you what, you know, this is the history, and this is the present moment, and this is trajectory for the future. So with cop cities, there are somewhere between 70 to 90 cop cities in the United States. Those are militarized zones in which they don't need our tax dollars anymore because they're going to the private corporations. And so based on the National Lawyers Guild, what is it called, podcast, when they were discussing things last night, I was watching, listening to the attorneys and other people. As citizens, we think we control the government because we pay taxes. We might want to rethink that. The other thing is, the assessment from last night from the attorneys and the organizers, was that after people saw the George Floyd uprising, and the vast majority of it was not violent, it was pacifist. If there's 90 around the country, some folks agree that there will never be protests like that again. And if that's the case, you have a fundamental redefinition of democracy. Yes, in the back, and then there's one here and there. Mm-hmm.
You talk about fear in very insightful ways, and I'm just curious because, you know, with the internet, we can be inundated with all of these horrible and graphic images of like bloodlust
Yeah.
and talking about, which can kind of lead to like being desensitized to it all and leading to like unawareness. And I think fear kind of insinuates awareness while being desensitized to something and unaware, you know, insinuates that you're not aware to it. So I'm just curious if that's something you see as well, and if you have any insights into the difference between those two.
Yeah, I think the visuals throw us off. I mean, a colleague of mine, Frank Wilderson, who did the work on Afro-pessimism, we had a conversation once, and he said that he wasn't ever going to watch that footage again because he considered it to be porn. And I remember as a feminist the work that I was doing on snuff porn, which is like the worst form of pornography because it actually entails the death of the woman. And usually these are runaways or undocumented women and girls who are put in these pornographics. You know, they just think they're going to get paid. They don't realize that their death is part of the performance, but it's not a performed death. It's actually an execution. And so at some point, I agreed with Frank, and I don't watch footage anymore. I did watch, I think the last I would have watched would have been Derek Chauvin. And it wasn't just the knee, it was a multiracial group on the sidewalk screaming and pleading. And I was like, there's care, they're mortified, they want to save a life, but they don't know how. And that's when I was like, so what do we know how to do anymore? Like in real time, it wasn't like on film. They saw a snuff porn unfold. And I was like, I just got weird. It's like, well, what if they linked arms and started skipping and singing and like approached the police thinking, well, they won't shoot us if we're skipping and singing. Like just sort of do something unexpected to get the upper hand to stop death. But the reality is we're not trained to stop death. Not when it comes from the state. And so like I have to decide, I feel like I've risked quite a bit, like in terms of what I write, and I've been assured that I can't be fired. You know, they're like, oh, we were wrong, that's not how it works. But I'm frustrated. So I can't even really answer, like what is to be done? I guess that was Lenin. But Martin Luther King, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? I don't care if you want Lenin or... They're actually saying the same thing, all right? What do you do with a hyper-arrogant, hyper-violent state that you cannot control? And even if you vote Biden out, you're going to get another form. This is when I was doing research on cop cities, and honestly, and I know there are other countries, but this would blew my mind, right? Because I was so from the South, especially from my mother. Like my father was bougie, he grew up that way with money, but she wasn't, and so civil rights was everything for her. It was like doing the research, and like at the same time that President Lyndon Baines Johnson, another Texan, was signing the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, handing the pen on to King, he was also greenlighting mercenaries assassinating Black intellectuals in Africa to support the apartheid. I was like, wait, you could, that's a weird coin to flip. So we celebrate our civil rights in the United States, but we don't ask what the US is doing in other countries, right? And in a way, I think we got captured. We obviously want to be safe. Nobody wants, a lot of us have families like, oh, remember that lynching of great, whatever. Like we have these narratives, right? We want to integrate in order to be safe, and we want to be productive. But what if what we're integrating into just becomes another Trojan horse, but with a black face? Think of it, the two people who vetoed the ceasefire in Palestine, one was Linda Thomas Greenfield, and then her head attaché. Both are African American. And Lloyd Austin, and I hope he's in and out of the hospital, so something's going on. I hope he, heals, whatever. But his job really, it was another black person first. Clarence Thomas is just really weird, so I don't even want to cite him. Yeah, but there's this way that black faces are becoming the poster face of U.S. empire. That will never be a good look for us. And we're so splintered because the prize was to get in. The prize was not marronage. I mean, I know radicals who are like committed to marronage and they're like, yeah, they can have that. I'm not going near it. But for the majority of us, we were raised. This is where I teach, why I teach, where I teach, right? And so I don't want to make it like, oh, you have to do more therapy. I would rather we had a strategic plan and that we could discipline, you mentioned discipline earlier, Connor, that we could discipline ourselves no matter how uncomfortable it becomes to stick with the plan. But there were a couple other people. Sorry about that, I do long answers. In the back. Yeah. Right, so the question becomes, why are civilians so threatened or perceived as being threatening by the state and by these militarists, right? So to the best, I'll respond to it. Obviously, I don't have a complete answer. If I recall correctly about what happened in El Salvador, it included Jesuit priests and also the 16 or 15-year-old daughter of the woman, but there was also a nun as well. 4 of them, so this would have been a separate killing. My understanding from study is that the majority of people who die and who are maimed in wars are not combatants, they're civilians. And that shifted after World War II. And part of that was tied, if you think about control of populations, it's the lack of stability, it's that, surprise moment. I didn't even go into the underground, but you came in and you killed my kids. When I was at the grocery store, you're always I can't even get the words. You can't stabilize your sector to even protest if they're death squads. And I was serious about learning to play kickball where people were training death squads. So we're on the same fort, except I was playing, at elementary school, and I'm a bit flabbergasted, again, about the tolerance for death. It would be one thing if war was about combatants killing other combatants, which I don't think they should do, but then I get it. It's like you went to war. But, you know, when you start killing 5-year-olds and 50-year-olds and housekeepers and nuns and priests and people who are praying, and I believe at one point somebody went into a church and you shoot it up. We see it here, like as one of those sort of white supremacist, one-off mental health issues. The U.S. has been doing this for decades before guns became the weapon of choice because of NRA and other factors, right? And I believe it's keeping civilians destabilized and so driven by fear that it's very difficult to organize a labor union. It's very difficult to organize a school that teaches children songs of liberation. It's difficult to keep land and cultivate food to feed the community because you're always looking over your shoulder. There's always a threat of violent death, right? And that is, if you read the history of the CIA, that's the game plan. And before, nobody would ever think of rolling it like that in the U.S. unless it was a racialized minority, you know? Like the history of slavery actually looks like what people were doing in these foreign wars that were not even legit. I mean, do we have, as Americans, I'm assuming we're all, or maybe not all citizens or even want to be, I said this once on a podcast, you would not let somebody break into your grandkids or your kids' kindergarten and start shooting up the room without having serious demands of how could this even happen. But because it's in other countries and it's not really happening to Europe, and most of the media is, quote, white and affluent focused, this just becomes normal. And once this kind of killing becomes normal, in order to achieve certain political outcomes, political econ or geopolitics, I feel personally then we have a bargain with the devil. And I'd like to break it. I'm just not sure how. I think there was one other person, one last question. Where? There, sorry.
We hear a lot about critical race theory,
Mm-hmm.
and some states have actually put into place punishment for teachers or educators who try to impart any type of knowledge or slavery about the rights and civil rights groups. So as educating yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and I think you teach college and university, what is your feedback from young people who want to know but who are being suppressed from them? And one other, I don't think they have time to go through this. We have watchdog organizations such as the NBC. I hear nothing from them. Lots of brutality cases, shootings, nothing from those organizations. So one, I need to know, what's your feedback from young people about being denied information about race and race relations in the U.S.?
Thank you for that. So in my zone, it's a little different because I would say most of the students who are being denied are probably going to be in public schools, are going to be in middle class, and probably in segments of the South or Missouri, other places like that. This is my take on the academia. It is really class stratified. So wealthy kids read whatever they want. You can't tell a kid whose parents are millionaires what they don't read. And so it's almost like the privilege of this class status, even if you don't come from the class, you become the scholarship kid who gets in that zone. It's not felt across the board. That's what I'm trying to say. In terms of the organizing, when I think of DeSantis and what he's done in Florida and elsewhere, I see this as clear anti-Black aggression, but that's just first on the list. And, you know, there are going to be other groups incorporated. How you resist book burning, how you resist book banning, I'm going to go back to local politics. If you can control the school board, I know there's like that whole scandal, you know, there was anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ, and what people do in their private lives are what they do in their private lives. But the hypocrisy is so deep, you know, you need a boat to float on it. So if you can have an impact on the New York City Council or with Mayor Adams and the Board of Education, that would be an important struggle, because the students deserve to have facts, not to have mythology that's starting to look really Nordic, and, you know, really just let's go back to the 1940s and 1950s. So it's a ban on intelligence, it's a ban on material facts, and it's a ban on progress. But I also have a criticism of critical race theory and company, not the kind that I learned from reading Derek Bell, like Faces at the Bottom of the Well. That's on a level of critical thinking which I found to be really sophisticated and deep and clearly political. Not all critical race theory hits that level. And some of it will be like, we need all, like, remember our history, but don't have a critique of capitalism. So, okay, well, the reason you got imperialism out of capitalism is because you had enslavement for several, like, those are all interwoven. So there are ways in which CRT will be like, we don't want to alienate our donors or our funders. We don't want to come too critical about the police or the military or the state, because we're also going to be campaigning for the DNC. And I think, and it wasn't just me, I think Joy Reid said this, and I rarely watch her, but, and that's not a diss of her, it's just I try not to watch mainstream news. She, I think at one point compared Biden with LBJ, when he just had to withdraw and say, I can't run again because of the war in Vietnam, right? If we're callous about the value of life, we can still study our heritage and celebrate it, but we're still callous about the value of life. So it's, yes, the children, the students, you know, from pre-K on need to understand that white nationalism is not going to be good. But at the same time, they need to understand imperialism is hell. And so if you have concentric circles of hell, like I don't know where Dante was going, you know, how many levels. But on one level, I believe, if I remember, one level you're frozen. That would be the worst level to be on. And so that we keep functioning, we keep loving, we would have to be bold. And exactly, advocate the way you're advocating, but then advocate more for all the concentric circles, right? Can we do just one more? One more?
So this may not be a concise enough question, but I'm curious if there are ways that you decided to practice attempts to divest from the state, both personally and collectively.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if I'm going to be honest. Okay, what I say is I decided I would publicly critique and print very prominent people that are beloved. But because I've been all around long enough and have organized in different places, like I wasn't formed in the academy. I've said this before, it's not a joke, it's real. My mother says she transitioned, I couldn't hold 9 to 5 because I don't listen. So, like, the academy is my post office job. So it's nice if you get stature and they pay you, but it wasn't the reason I got in it. It's like I got fired from a lot of other jobs. But when when they say when you see something, say something, that's not really what most people want. They want to feel comfortable in their choices, and they want to believe that liberals are actually revolutionaries. I am not a revolutionary. I never claimed to be. But I can discern and I can distinguish. And also I've gone in prisons. I anthologized political prisoners, met with them, and other people here have gone offshore and met with people, right? There's a vanity that we have, and it may be tied to our insecurity. We want to be safe and we want to be fierce at the same time. Those two don't coexist. So if I had any function, it would be that one brat who's bothering you saying emperor has no clothes, empress has no clothes. And I'm not talking about Biden or Harris. I'm talking about the ways in which our intellectualism has formed and presented itself as a cure without ever having gone to war. So I don't know if that answers your question. Okay. All right, thank you so much.
Yeah, that was brilliant, Doctor. Thank you so much for that. I don't think I have the capacity to sum up all the places that we went in that conversation, but I'm not asking you this question, but if I had the opportunity to ask the question, I would ask. I remember you shaping my engagement with the academy years ago, and this thing that you said where you said the academy has no revolutionary desire, right? And that really struck me as someone who was trying to pursue work in the academy in a way that I hoped would be liberating or potentially revolutionary in some way. And I lost my first naivete with that, and that's been borne out by my own understanding. So then the question I think I would ask now, these days, given the work that I do now, is, does the church have revolutionary desire? This world that you are pointing to, articulating, is that kind of violence, that bloodthirst, that apocalypse, something that the church is positioned to step into? My work has been sort of suggesting that it is possible to have that desire. So often I'm butting up against people who don't personally, right? Who want to be safe, want to be fierce and safe at the same time. So that's core to your work, are things that are core to my work, and where I'm hoping that we go as a church. There's, it's more painful for me than anyone else to conclude this time together, but Dr. James has lots of books, and we have time and opportunity to get together and continue to talk about some of these things. And so I hope that if nothing else, folks have taken an interest, a keen interest in what precisely the stakes are and how the church fits into this. So thank you all so much for being here, and thank you especially to Dr. Joy James. Can we give her another round of applause? Dr. James, I think some folks would like you to sign their books if you feel like it. Oh, yeah. Well, you... Cool. All right. Have a great day, everybody.